So think of Elon Musk, and what comes to your mind is the ugly Twitter spat between him and American President Donald Trump. That's the emotional side of Elon. But then there's also an extraordinary side to him. Think of brands like SpaceX, Tesla, Starlink. That's what the extraordinary side of Elon Musk is all about. But following this spat, what really happens to SpaceX's support to NASA's space programs? There's much to unravel. And to unpack that with me today, I have Dr. Malcolm Davis, who is a senior security analyst at ASPI. ASPI stands for Australia Strategy Policy Institute at Canberra. Dr. Davis is not only an old friend, but also he has very strong research interests in areas such as future warfare, future military technology, Chinese military modernization, nuclear weapons, as well as what brings him today to ThePrint Uninterrupted, which is military space and air power. Very pleased to be joined by you, Malcolm, and very happy that you agreed to speak to us. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Swasti. It's fantastic to be here. Great to be speaking to you again after such a long time, and really looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, so I mean, let's just hit the nail straight on the head. We all know that Musk has been pretty important, especially SpaceX has been pretty important when it comes to NASA's programs and all the support. But before I come to what happens now, since Donald Trump and Elon Musk have no longer are no longer on the same terms, but before that, you just help me understand a little bit. Even before the spat, I think Donald Trump wasn't very happy with NASA's budget, isn't it?
Well, certainly there was rather a lot of concern in the US space policy community and indeed beyond the US as a result of the White House putting out what's known as the skinny budget, which would have significantly gutted NASA's spending on a number of key programs, most of those on space science, I have to say. In particular, most of those on space science related to climate change. But nevertheless, it would have set back NASA's international reputation and its ability to do space science, including a number of important probes to the outer planets, which are currently out there. You have the Juno mission out near Jupiter. You have another mission, Shoemaker-Levy, that's out near the Kuiper Belt. All of these would have been cancelled. So those probes effectively would have had their communications link cut, and they would have sailed off into the endless void of space, which wouldn't have been a good look. So most of the cuts were to space science related to climate change, and I think that probably reflects the Trump administration's skepticism about climate change. But nevertheless, it would have been a huge blow to NASA's credibility.
And what about this this Dragon capsule? We all know that Dragon capsule is what NASA uses for shuttling between us and the space, right, from between Earth and the space station. So, do you think, even remotely speaking, is there a chance of that contract getting cancelled? And in the larger, broader framework, I mean, how does this uncertainty play out? It's extremely unhealthy for long-term scientific collaborations, isn't it?
Well, the Dragon spacecraft currently is the US's only way to send astronauts up to the International Space Station, as well as to do other low Earth orbit missions with astronauts. Now, when this crisis broke out between Trump and Elon Musk, Trump suggested that he was going to cancel SpaceX's or Musk's government contracts. And Musk's response was, well, we'll begin to decommission the Dragon capsule. If Musk had actually gone through with that, then essentially the US ability to send astronauts and return astronauts from the International Space Station would have been lost, and they would have then been reliant, ironically, on the Russians to get astronauts up and back from the space station. Now, Musk has backed down from that threat to decommission the Dragon spacecraft, I think because he had a look at the implications of that, knowing that his Starship vehicle is yet to be operationally proven, and recognized that actually it would have been an own goal. He would have been shooting himself in the foot by doing that, because he would have lost all that revenue from those missions. So he's backed off from that for the moment. But what worries me is that Trump may continue to push And indeed, if you look at social media, he's continuing to attack Elon Musk. And
Right.
so you never know with Musk. He might come back next week and say, right, that's it. We're cancelling Dragon. If that happens, as I said, the US loses its access to the International Space Station. It loses the ability to send astronauts into low Earth orbit for scientific missions. And then the Russians gain as a result. And what's left is that it's Russia and China that can send astronauts into space, but not the Americans.
Well, I would have asked you this emerging equation, of course, between Russia and China, but just help me understand. Russians also have Soyuz, right? And Americans, until at least before the Ukraine war began, were actually depending on Soyuz as well. And that's when Elon Musk stepped in and also gave them this opportunity to use Dragon. Now, what is the equation currently between the Americans and their stand on using the Soyuz? As far as I know, it still stands, right? I mean, that collaboration hasn't really been cancelled completely.
That's correct. You still have American astronauts launching on Soyuz and coming back on Soyuz, but the preference is to use Dragon if at all possible, because the Americans are trying to essentially wean themselves off reliance on Russia for obvious reasons. So I think that if this crisis once again re-emerged and Musk followed through with his threat to cancel Dragon, then you would have a gap until SpaceX's Starship vehicle was operationally in service. You would have a significant gap in terms of the US ability to actually fly astronauts into space.
And also, if you could just help me understand a little bit, Malcolm, because you've been following this for, many decades now, and I know that for sure because when I started reading out on these things, I think the first piece that I read was yours, and that's how I sort of got to know you. But just help me understand a little bit, and I'm sure the viewers would also be interested in learning. I mean, what is the technical difference, if any, between Dragon capsule and the Soyuz capsule?
Well, Soyuz, it's a fairly old design. It's basically a standard space capsule that is not reusable. So it launches up into space on a Soyuz rocket and basically docks with the space station. Then when it re-enters, the heat shield of the Soyuz ablates, and that's it. You can't use the Soyuz again. Dragon is a reusable spacecraft. So it launches on a Falcon rocket and essentially flies up to the space station or flies to a commercial platform or whatever its mission is. Does that, then re-enters and basically can be reused again several times. So it is a much more cost-effective way of accessing space than an old-fashioned expendable capsule.
Right. And there is also, if I'm not wrong, contracts to the tune of 20 or 30 billion dollars, that SpaceX has received from the US government. I mean, can you just help us understand what these contracts are all about, and which of these have become vulnerable, especially after what happened between Elon Musk and Donald Trump?
Well, as I said, Trump suggested I will freeze the contracts provided to Elon Musk, and it wasn't just about SpaceX. It was about various different other aspects of Musk's business as well. But SpaceX would have been the main company that would have suffered. And I think that what you are seeing is that SpaceX has essentially taken over the vast majority of space launch activity in the United States these days, for the simple reason that its reusable launch vehicles are so much more cost effective compared to expendable launch vehicles. If you compare, for example, NASA's Space Launch System, the SLS, which is designed to take the Artemis spacecraft to the moon in coming missions, that costs anywhere between $2 billion and $4 billion per launch. And they're planning on launching that once every 2 years, maybe. SpaceX's Starship vehicle, which is still in development, the last one they launched, got further along in its test flight before it lost control and burnt up in re-entry over the Indian Ocean. But once that's operational, Starship is fully reusable, and it will cost $10 million per launch, and it can put up 100 tons into low Earth orbit compared to the SLS only putting up about 70 tons. So $2 to $4 billion per launch versus $10 million per launch. SLS launches once every 1 to 2 years. Starship launches once a week. And they're producing large numbers of Starship vehicles. So those contracts that the US government is providing to SpaceX are going primarily at the moment to Falcon launch vehicles with Dragon, or with basically deploying satellites into orbit. But in the future, they'll be going to Starship, and Starship will have a transformational effect on how we access space. And if those contracts were rescinded, then all of that goes away. We lose Starship, we lose Dragon, we lose Falcon, and essentially the US ability to access space is severely restrained as a result.
And there were more ambitions, right? I mean, I remember that just 6 months ago, when Donald Trump was still the president-elect, and there was just so much enthusiasm about how SpaceX is now going to completely overhaul so many of NASA's programs, including the Moon program, and help us understand that a little bit, because there was this thing of actually switching to the Mars program. So, I mean, what happens to that one?
Well, this could be sort of where a lot of this sort of uncertainty is emerging. Musk is very dedicated to going on what's known as a Mars first strategy, where his goal is to establish a permanent, self-sustaining and expanding human colony on Mars. He envisages a city on Mars of 1 million people by 2050, which is unrealistic, to be honest. But nevertheless, he's building the infrastructure to get humans to Mars relatively quickly. NASA's approach, which I think is the wiser approach, is a moon-first approach, which gets humans back to the moon, ideally before the Chinese get there, in which the Chinese are planning to get there by 2030. NASA's approach around the Artemis missions would see Artemis 2 being launched on an SLS rocket in late 26, and do basically a circumlunar orbit around the moon and then come back to Earth, same as Apollo 8. Then Artemis 3 would land astronauts on the lunar surface. So basically get human astronauts back to the lunar surface by, say, early 2027. At the moment, it's uncertain whether NASA can achieve that. But a key part of the infrastructure, that the architecture of those missions, is a SpaceX Starship designed as the lunar lander that gets humans from lunar orbit down to the surface. So if the Trump administration were to cancel SpaceX's contracts, then Starship doesn't happen for the lunar landing role. And so Artemis then is essentially, uncertain as to how they would get the astronauts down to the surface. Long and short of that would be Artemis would be significantly delayed, and in all likelihood, the Chinese would get to the moon first.
Right. So now just sort of let's talk a little bit about how Russia is getting pushed with China in all spheres of statecraft, and I would say strategic ambitions and aspirations, including space maneuvers. So, I mean, your initial thoughts on where all this is certainly giving some sort of an advantage to Chinese plans to get on, to the moon first and sort of outpace the rest of the world. But how would you articulate that?
Well, look, I think at the moment the Americans are in some disarray. Senator Ted Cruz from Congress has pushed back against the skinny NASA budget and basically suggested $10 billion to get US astronauts back to the moon before the Chinese get there. The big concern with allowing the Chinese to get to the moon first is that it's a huge prestige propaganda win for Beijing. It essentially cements the perspective that America is on the wane and on the decline, China is on the rise, and China is the emerging dominant space actor for the 21st century. And I think that the US, I think, cannot afford to let the Chinese get to the moon first, for practical reasons, because they would then control the terrain on the moon that is resource rich, and they could deny it to the United States and to others, including to countries like India and Japan that want to access it as well. Russia is part of China's group. They have a project called the International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS, that they want to set up at the South Lunar Pole, close to all those resources. Initially, that ILRS station would be unmanned and roboticized, but eventually by the mid-2030s, they would have astronauts and cosmonauts on the lunar surface. But if the Chinese get there first, because the Americans have essentially thrown the game away by getting into political squabbling and cancelling contracts, and Musk essentially refusing to proceed with Dragon, or indeed being unable to proceed with Starship, then essentially the Americans have got only themselves to blame. If the Chinese then are in the dominant position, they get to the moon first, they control all the lunar resources, and they deny it to others.
Right, interesting. And I mean, let's now speak a little bit about the militarization of space, and that also is something which has been irking the rest of the world. I mean, of course, keeping in mind what China does and how callous can China be when it comes to its space maneuvers. But wasn't there also huge plans and ambitious plans for a gigantic missile defense shield? In space, and that's also something that Elon Musk and Donald Trump had probably planned for. Or, I mean, is my reading correct? And what happens to that now? And not just with respect to Trump, but with respect to America's long-term aspirations.
Yeah, well, certainly what you're talking about there is the Golden Dome, and I think that Trump's idea with Golden Dome is to essentially build on the legacy of the 1980s SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, or what was then known as Star Wars, and then the 1990s Global Protection Against Limited Strikes, GPALs, which included this concept known as brilliant pebbles that would have seen space-based interceptors designed to shoot down warheads in space. Trump's idea with Golden Dome is to create a network of space-based sensors and space-based interceptors tied together with ground-based systems to be able to do what's known as boost phase intercept. In other words, if a missile is launched, then the sensor picks it up immediately, and a space-based interceptor flying overhead can essentially shoot that missile down whilst it's in its boost phase when it's moving at its slowest. So it's a different approach to SDI, which would have seen essentially large battles in space using large laser weapons and so forth. This is a different approach. I think the technology has moved on a fair bit from the 1980s and the 1990s. So Golden Dome, from a technological perspective, is still extremely challenging. And I would argue that it's never going to create an Astrodome leak-proof defense that Trump thinks it will. But what it will do is actually enhance the US and allied ability to counter Chinese and Russian limited missile attacks. So the sorts of Chinese threats that we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific, such as their intermediate range ballistic missiles, their hypersonic weapons, Golden Dome can play a role there. And that's where I think also allies such as Japan and Australia and South Korea could also play a role in that. If this dispute between Musk and Trump continues and gets out of control, and Trump, in a hissy fit, basically cancels SpaceX's contracts, and Musk refuses to basically come back and work on these sorts of capabilities, then Golden Dome falls apart. And we're back to essentially traditional deterrence of, well, the US needs large numbers of nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attack. So I think that Golden Dome is certainly one aspect that we're focused on. The other aspect, of course, is China and Russia moving very assertively towards developing space weapons capabilities to attack our satellites in orbit. The Chinese are producing a full suite of counter space capabilities, both direct descent, co-orbital and ground-based, hard kill and soft kill capabilities that are designed to be able to hold at risk US and allied space capabilities. The Russians are doing the same thing, but they're also producing a nuclear weapons-based anti-satellite capability that, if deployed, would be a direct violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. So on the one hand, you've got the US trying to defend itself against missile threats with Golden Dome, but you've also got the US trying to respond to this growing threat by China and Russia of space weaponization. That's why you're seeing the US moving much more assertively with US Space Force towards a space warfighting capability, because I think that the US is recognizing that, all good intentions aside, efforts within international fora in terms of legal and diplomatic and arms control approaches are just not working. The Chinese and the Russians are ignoring them.
So Malcolm, at this stage, I mean, we've been talking a little bit about space weaponization, and we know that, Russia and China have their own designs, but just help me understand a little bit about all the tech sanctions that Russia is under. I mean, for the last 3 years, Russia right now is one of the most sanctioned country on earth. It's been cut off from Western tech, etc. Now, the question is that has that impacted Russia's ability in any way for its all these aspirations regarding space? And two, if so, to what degree has it pushed Russia with China?
Look, Russia was with China before Russia invaded Ukraine. A few days before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Putin and Xi had a meeting where they basically declared a no limits partnership. Xi said to Putin, "We are seeing changes in the world not seen in a century, and we, as in Russia and China, are driving those changes." So I think that it's not a case of Western sanctions driving Russia closer to China. Russia and China have been together well before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and I find it hard to believe that Putin did not fully brief Xi on his intentions to invade Ukraine. Xi was in the know right from the get-go. Okay, and so what you're seeing now is Russia and China moving ever closer together. China providing Russia with militarily relevant technologies that is allowing it to circumvent the greatest effect of Western sanctions. And in space, there's not a lot that Western sanctions are doing to prevent Russia from moving down the path of be it conventional space weapons or indeed these nuclear-based anti-satellite capabilities. So the Western sanctions that are being applied after Russia's invasion of Ukraine have been completely ineffective in preventing Russia from building up these sorts of capabilities. And certainly I would argue that Russia and China have been coordinating at a strategic level well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So basically, what, if I understand you correctly, Malcolm, what you're saying is that Russia's and China's, say, collaboration in space and weaponization of space, exploration of space, has not been impacted at all by all the technological sanctions that the West has put.
That's correct. Russia has been working with China on space weapons capabilities going back to the early 2000s. I mean, when you look at essentially China's test in 2009 of an anti-satellite weapon, Russia had similar capabilities then. They've been working together in basically an axis of authoritarian states that also includes North Korea and Iran, working together and coordinating actions, I think, really since, I would argue, the early 2020s. So I think that this goes well back before Ukraine.
All right. And since we are talking so much about the space maneuvers, and I think space has become pretty much a crowded affair lately, in the last one decade at least. And that is also, and I know you've written on it as well, but that also brings us to this very relevant topic, even though Donald Trump wouldn't like to believe it. I don't know what he thinks about that when it comes to space, but this entire problem of the increasing space debris. I mean, how are we going to tackle that? There is a 1967 Outer Space Treaty. We know that has been not very effective. There are a lot of other problems when it comes to binding regulations on such behavior. What happens to this ever-increasing space debris?
Look, I think it's going to get worse because more and more states are going to build mega constellations of small satellites in low Earth orbit. So there needs to be some sort of technical solution to this. I often regard this challenge as an opportunity for a commercial company to be able to clear space debris and make profit from it. There's also the whole issue of space logistics that can essentially resupply, refuel, and upgrade satellites that have essentially died in orbit and make them useful again, or move them to graveyard orbit. So there's various different technical and business solutions that I think can help in reducing the effect of space debris, but it is a serious issue. I think as we go down the path of satellite mega constellations, we're going to start to need to use artificial intelligence more to avoid collisions in space, to manage these very large constellations. And I think that there's opportunities there for commercial companies really to come to the fore to help deal with this. So over time, I would argue that we can start to clear some of that space debris, but it's going to take time and it's going to take investment in the right sorts of technologies.
But Malcolm, the problem isn't just about technology, right? I mean, you know that one of the things, and I've also worked on it, and that's how, I sort of understand a few nuances, and I would be very happy if you were to bring them out also for the wider audience to understand that this is not just about technology. It's also got to do with the fact that there are spacefaring nations that are more responsible, and there are spacefaring nations like China that are not responsible. So one of the ASAT testing that China did, in fact, the first one, created so much debris because
Yep.
they simply did not invest enough in controlled re-entries, isn't it? It takes time and money and effort to actually go for controlled re-entry, so that it doesn't just fall anywhere. But help us understand a little bit also for the layperson, what is the best way to understand and differentiate between responsible spacefaring and irresponsible spacefaring?
I think you're right. I mean, I think that when you look at China, for example, you regularly see reports of them launching rockets and then having the rockets fall down on neighboring villages, which is highly irresponsible. And the same goes with the deployment of satellites in orbit, that they do create sort of space debris. I think the Chinese sort of learned a lesson from that test in 2007. Russians did one in 2021 that actually threatened not only the International Space Station with space debris, but also the Chinese Tiangong space station with space debris. And the Russians didn't seem to care. And the very fact that they're now looking at a nuclear weapons-based ASAT suggests that they really don't care about international legal obligations or for sustainable space. So there's a diplomatic problem there in terms of how do we get countries like China and Russia to actually play by the rules when they feel they're under no obligation to do so. Yes, of course, they're under a legal obligation and under an arms control obligation. But if there's no enforcement mechanism in those legal and arms control agreements, which is the key problem with space law, in my opinion, there's no enforcement mechanism, then they can do what they like. And I think this extends to other areas such as space resource utilization, where under the Outer Space Treaty, countries are not meant to claim ownership of territory on the moon and other celestial bodies. Well, you watch, the Chinese will do exactly that because there's no way to enforce the Outer Space Treaty. I mean, are we seriously going to put sanctions on China? Russia will simply veto any UN resolution and vice versa. So I think that there's a serious issue here in terms of our diplomatic and legal approach to space suits sustainability because there's no enforcement, there's no political will to think about enforcement, and there's an assumption on the part of the space law community that somehow the Chinese and the Russians will play by the rules, when in actual fact the reality is they're not playing by the rules. And this is only going to become more and more challenging as more stuff is put up there in terms of satellite mega constellations and other systems and platforms.
Right. And I mean, it's just very interesting to note that it's also Chinese doublespeak. I mean, I have gone a little deep into the Chinese literature on when they launched that anti-satellite test, and I was really surprised to see that they had actually maintained officially that they are going to be very responsible, and they are a very responsible spacefaring nation, and they are going to abide by all the rules and regulations. But then they land up doing exactly the opposite, as you said, and that's part of the complexity of the problem. That how do you actually ensure that they fall in line, because there's nothing to sort of make them really fall in line if they don't want to, and that really complicates things. But Malcolm, also help me understand, you've also been watching the performance of so many spacefaring nations. India has also been a spacefaring nation. In fact, our ASAT test, especially when compared to China, was hailed by the international community for really adhering by responsible standards, etc. What do you generally think of, and how would you evaluate India's, space programs and India's ISRO, of course?
Look, it's very good. I mean, the fact that India did that ASAT test in a way that was deliberately designed to deorbit the debris as quickly as possible, I think was commendable. And Russia and China should have learned from that. I think when you look at the American one in 2008, that they took out a satellite that was containing radioactive material and hazardous chemicals on board, they did the same thing. They deliberately did it in a way that deorbited the debris as fast as possible. Russia and China don't do that. So I think India, I think, is an example that other countries should follow. The very fact that India is making some really impressive gains in space in terms of getting probes to the moon, I think has been quite impressive. But
Yeah.
just the last few days, Japan unfortunately lost a lander at the moon because of a failed laser rangefinder. So landing on the moon is hard, but India has done it very effectively with Chandrayaan. So I think that India, I think is quite advanced. It's making good progress. I think they're well on their way to getting Indian astronauts in space. And I think that India is going to be a major space power of the 21st century, alongside the United States and Japan as well.
And I'm happy you mentioned that, because India's Air Force officer Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla is a part of India's Gaganyaan mission, and this is set to launch from the Kennedy Space Center very soon. I think on June 10, and this is a very good, ambitious collaboration between ISRO and NASA. So of course we are all looking forward to that, and we're very proud as a country. And I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think just the last bit, Malcolm, this has been very useful and extremely full of a lot of learnings, but just help me understand, is it possible for, and I'm circling back to all the drama that is happening in the US right now, is it even legally possible to just cancel these contracts whenever anybody wants? I mean, are there not legal obligations to maintain?
Look, SpaceX has got a launch queue full of satellites from other countries. If Trump cancels the contracts and SpaceX can't fly, then what happens to all those launch contracts with other countries? So it's not as simple as what Trump was thinking of in a fit of anger. He's just going to cancel those contracts. There would be legal constraints on his ability to do so, and I think probably that's why he's backed off from that, and Musk has backed off from decommissioning Dragon. I mean, Musk will decommission Dragon eventually once Starship is operational, but that could be a year or two down the track. So until Starship is flying and safe and proven, Dragon is it. And I think that, so I would expect to see Dragon continue to fly. I would expect and I would hope that advisors in the Trump team are saying to President Trump, saying, don't cancel Musk's contracts because it has all sorts of legal implications. And it leaves us in the lurch in terms of our ability to access space.
Right. And also, Malcolm, before I let you go, please help us learn, what is it that you are writing these days? What are you researching on these days?
Well, we've just come out of a very busy period when ASPI produced a big report called The Cost of Defense. That's gone out. So we're all kind of like, and we've also had our annual defense conference last week. So we're all kind of taking a breather at this point, and it's a long weekend down here in Australia. So we're taking a bit of a break. We're back into work next week on Tuesday, and I think we're now going to have a planning day where we're actually going to work out what's happening in the second half of the year. For me, my focus is on finishing up a paper, about a 10,000-word paper on Australian national space strategy, why we need a national space strategy. At the moment, we have separate civil and defence space strategies. There was an effort by the previous Morrison government to establish a national space strategy, but it was cancelled by the current Albanese government, and that's left Australia's space community a bit adrift. So I think that I'm going to finish that paper up, and then I'll probably be focusing on more space-related themes as well as nuclear deterrence themes going through the second half of this year.
I'm sure about that because you are a committed sky gazer, and I know how deeply you feel for space, Malcolm. But on that note, thank you so much for joining us for the Print Uninterrupted and actually telling me all these details. And actually, I'm sure the audiences are going to benefit a lot from these technical inputs that you just gave us. So thank you so much, and looking forward to hosting you sometime soon again.
Thank you very much, Swasti. It's been a pleasure.